All right, we're going to go ahead and kick it off.
Hauka, Noshkana Unachihi. I'm the tribal liaison of San Diego State University, and I'm now going to read the Kumeyaay Land Acknowledgement. We stand upon a land that carries the footsteps of millennia of Kumeyaay people. They are a people whose traditional lifeways intertwine with a worldview of earth and sky. In a community of living beings, this land is part of a relationship that has nourished, healed, protected, and embraced the Kumeyaay people to the present day. It is part of a worldview founded in the harmony of the cycles of the sky and the balance and the forces of life. For the Kumeyaay, red and black represent the balance of those forces that provide for harmony within our bodies, as well as the world around us. As students, faculty, staff, and alumni of San Diego State University, we acknowledge this legacy from the Kumeyaay. We promote this balance in life as we pursue our goals of knowledge and understanding. We find inspiration in the Kumeyaay spirit to open our minds and hearts. It is a legacy of the red and black. It is the land of the Kumeyaay. Hiechan, my heart is good. Nyomum, Nepachis.
Unmute. Since this is a global event, we invite you to share your local land acknowledgement in the chat. We also want to share that the speakers recognize that inclusion of Indigenous people is crucial to addressing the climate crisis. As stewards of the land, their knowledge and experience of being part of, not separate from, our environment is critical to this work. While acknowledging Indigenous land is symbolic and appreciated, active inclusion of Indigenous people can guide us towards solutions. Hello, and welcome to CANI COP26 Climate Action Week. I'm Adrienne Fusick, Director of International Programs and Partnerships at San Diego State University, and I'm a CANI Global Board member.
And hello, my name is Ine Williams, and I'm a Global Education Abroad Advisor at San Diego State, but also on the CANI Global Board and an International Education Specialist.
Hi, everybody. I'm Megan Swanek. I'm the Director of University Partnerships at the GREEN program. We do study abroad programs focused on sustainable development, and I am a CANI member who's been collaborating with my co-presenters here on climate justice topics for about 2 years now.
So we are absolutely thrilled to kick off Climate Action Week with this session on climate justice and international education. Climate justice is a core component of CANI's work, and we believe it must be front and center in all endeavors to address climate action. We're delighted you're here, and we hope you learn, engage, and begin to consider next steps for taking action in addressing climate justice. So a few housekeeping issues always. If you're comfortable doing so, we invite you to, well, actually, whether you're comfortable with it or not, please mute your mic during the presentation. Videos can go one way or another, it doesn't matter to us. Feel free to add questions and comments to the chat, and we'll address those after the presentation. And throughout our time together, we'll drop resources in the chat. So please go ahead and save those to look at them later. We've actually put together a resource list too, so we'll send those to you after the session as well. And we want to remind you that there's going to be a networking session immediately following the presentation. So we've received feedback from attendees of every past CANI event indicating you want to discuss the topics immediately after the sessions. So if there are any pressing questions from the chat, we'll go ahead and address those after the presentation, and then quickly move into those smaller groups for networking, and the presenters can also address questions that you have at that time. So Ine, Megan, and I will move between the rooms, and we'll be able to talk about these topics with you. So we want to start today by bringing you a welcome message from one of CANI's co-founders, Pitulia Nicola.
Welcome. Thank you for joining us in the CANI COP26 climate justice discussion. I'm Pitulia Nicola, and I'm one of the co-founders of CANI. COP26 is a good moment to take stock and reflect on the past few years, as well as to consider how we can incentivize more ambitious action in the years to come. CANI started in 2019 as a small group of people eager to push the climate discussion within the international education sector. At that point of time, the awareness of the issue was still at its infancy. And what progress have we seen in just a few years? Climate emergency and other sustainability issues are moving towards the very core of our sector. CANI has played a role in the process by organizing a number of events, creating resources, and working with stakeholders across the globe. CANI wants to see an international education sector which takes ownership of the climate crisis and catalyzes bold action to transform how we educate, collaborate, and advocate for the future generation of students. CANI's role has been and is to empower, energize, and mobilize international education stakeholders to address the climate crisis with urgent and decisive action. We want international education stakeholders to take ambitious action to reduce their own carbon footprint, but also to use their influence within their own organizations and beyond to enhance the positive handprint of the sector. We want to see this to take place in collaboration with others and in a way that considers questions of intergenerational equity and wider questions of climate justice. Thank you for joining us today to discuss this topic, and we hope to see many of you join CANI and help us in this important work.
So our mission for our time together today is to have you leave the session inspired to make social justice an integral component of your climate action work. As the field of international education transforms to reduce the harm that we're currently causing to the planet, it's crucial that we understand the social impacts of a climate crisis and create restorative solutions. We envision a just transition and call on you to advocate within your spheres of influence, whether that's student recruitment, program administration, policy creation, or any other aspect of the field, to ensure social justice is front and center. So we plan to accomplish this by covering 3 areas. First, Ine will talk you through the basic science of climate change and major sources of greenhouse gas emissions. Then we'll discuss how the climate crisis is connected to injustices and summarize some of the many impacts felt around the world. We'll then take a look at climate justice through an international education lens. For this, we'll share, visualize, and describe what these intersections can mean for international education. And we'll look at some examples to help spark dialogue and action.
So we've all been hearing language during this experience of looking at how the climate's been changing. Things like we're in a code red for humanity, or our house is on fire when we're talking about climate change. And the language choices that we speak to can really make a difference in how people see this issue. Climate impacts are becoming increasingly more common, intense, and it's really not enough anymore to talk about just climate change when the impacts are really slapping us right in the face. And now, even if you have not had if you've managed to avoid feeling climate impacts directly, the extent to which our families, our friends, our neighbors, our colleagues, our partners, humanity is being impacted, that creates an echo of that slap that just resonates across the globe, and it hits every single one of us. Jenny Lee is a professor at the University of Arizona, and she was featured she was a guest in one of the recent CANI Climate Dialogue podcasts. And I love how she said at one point, how much more urgent can urgent be? And how much more of an emergency can an emergency look like? Till we act, right? So that's where you're going to hear us start to shift a little bit more and using our language to emphasize what we're experiencing right now as a climate crisis. We'll still describe global warming, we'll still describe climate change, but we'll also emphasize the reality of the situation that we're in right now by using more accurate and current language. And to understand how we've reached this climate crisis point, let's start by navigating some of the science basics. So the greenhouse effect is describing the process the Earth has in place to regulate its temperature and how excess greenhouse gases really disrupt that process. The sun releases energy down to the Earth as solar radiation, and some of the energy is actually absorbed and re-radiated out as heat. So the greenhouse gases are working to amplify the solar energy and retain that heat. Now, under normal conditions, that's wonderfully fine. The Earth is happy and it stays stable at around 15 degrees Celsius or around 59 degrees Fahrenheit. But when you add burning of fossil fuels to that, it adds this extra layer of greenhouse gases, and the atmosphere is essentially thickening up. It's blanketing and thickening the Earth's atmosphere, burning its natural and balanced cycle of heat absorption. So if you have too much heat being retained, and that's what's leading to global warming. And over time, that turns into climate change. And now we're in a stage of a climate crisis as the Earth's baseline temperature is really continuing to elevate unless we change, right? So a comprehensive summary of this science is outlined in the details of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report, the IPCC report, and we're going to share a link to that in the chat. But let's look at where those excess greenhouse gases are actually coming from. I know in international education, we tend to talk a lot about transportation as our field's primary carbon emission source and negative contribution to the climate crisis. And that's, for good reason. People do need to fly places, like a lot of the students we serve. That's not the only way, of course. But this image from Project Drawdown was compiled using a lot of the information from the IPCC report. And it highlights other areas such as electricity and heat absorption, food, agriculture, and land use that are accounting for larger proportions of the greenhouse gas emissions. About 60% of excess greenhouse gas emissions remain in the atmosphere, and that contributes to the warming of the Earth, while current carbon sinks absorb some of those carbon emissions. A carbon sink is anything that absorbs more carbon from the atmosphere than it releases, such as plants and ocean, soil. A carbon source is anything that releases more carbon into the atmosphere than it absorbs. So like the burning of fossil fuels or volcanic eruptions. But I do want to be clear, carbon dioxide, carbon, is not the only greenhouse gas emission. It's just one of the most abundant. So it kind of becomes the baseline that we talk about. We're working to connect these dots across the links of climate crisis, racial and social injustice, and international education. And sometimes that starts by unpacking things like the science, as well as some of our everyday experiences and educational knowledge. So let's continue unpacking some information to just better understand the ties between the climate crisis and injustice. So let me start by just saying, I'm an American descendant of slaves. So when I think about the United States and our independence from colonizers, I'm like, okay, the UK was colonizing our area, and the people that I'm coming from, my ancestors, were not part of the freedom struggle. So I think a lot about colonization in relation to my own personal experience. And if you look at our global histories, they're full of colonization exploits that highlight patterns of economic pursuits tied to seeking and collecting resources, such as land, to build wealth and power, and often beginning with displacement, marginalization of indigenous communities, and knowledge. The climate crisis is tied to our extraction and use of resources, while also then the direct consequences of the pursuit of those resources being felt by the local communities, often first and worst. Ongoing levels of consumption, pollution, it just can't really be maintained as they exist right now. Our population can't support behavior without thought for consequences to the Earth and its inhabitants. So when I look at this quote that I have up here, the exploitation of our planet's natural resources has always been tied to the exploitation of people of color. One of the things I start to think about is the prevalence of certain languages across the globe. Spanish, French, English, Portuguese, for example. I could add Mandarin to that mix. How are those languages existing? That maps out our history of colonization and who was impacted. So my first global experience was actually driving from Oakland, California to Jalisco, Mexico when I was 14. And I really found at that point, that's when I understood that the United States was not the only America. It wasn't until I talked to someone and said, hey, we're America too. I'm like, oh. But Spain was one of the primary colonizers of Latin America and had about 100-year head start in colonial exploits in comparison to, let's say, Great Britain. Colonization of the Americas by Spain and Portugal impacted indigenous communities across the Americas and influenced the direction of the transatlantic slave trade and chattel slavery as well. So we have this set of deep, wide roots in these histories and colonization ideologies that are spread throughout existing systems, structures, institutions, policies, practices, beliefs, values, and economics. I mean, the climate crisis impact is layered, and it's in this complicated mix. It's pushing us to our limits, forcing a closer examination and re-education to address humanity and injustice.
Thanks, Ine. So as Ine emphasized, colonization and the exploitation of people of color continues to have impacts through systems and structures that maintain and perpetuate inequity and equality. And the climate crisis is making it worse. So according to World Bank, the climate crisis could push 130 million people into poverty in the next 10 years. And there's asymmetry between those who are contributing and those who are being most affected. So as you see here, the richest half of the world is responsible for 86% of greenhouse gas emissions, and the poorest half for just 14%. So the richest are responsible for the vast majority of greenhouse gas emissions, but the climate's response to those emissions is disproportionately hitting the communities who contribute the least. So we see these trends both within countries and between countries. Around the globe, low-income urban communities tend to have less tree cover and green space than nearby higher income communities. So there tends to be too much asphalt and not enough trees. And some of these low-income urban communities have been measured to be 3 to 10 degrees hotter than their neighboring higher income communities. And research has shown that people in communities without adequate tree cover have a 5% higher chance of dying from heat-related illnesses. So we also see these disparities between high income and low income countries. So for example, children born in high income countries will see twice as many extreme weather events as their parents. And children born in low income countries will see 3 times as many. So we also talk about climate migration, and Megan will talk about this a little bit more in the next slide. But this is basically when students, see where my mind is, where people are forced to leave their homes because the climate crisis has made their area uninhabitable. So we see this affecting primarily low-income communities and regions that are already marginalized. So I can provide a couple examples that are really close to me. So during the Camp Fire in Paradise, California, one of my friend's parents' homes was completely destroyed along with the entire community. They lived there because it was affordable. After the fire, they were among the many people who had to spend months camping in a Walmart parking lot. So 85 people died in that fire, and my friend's parents and many others were permanently displaced. The second example I want to talk about just quickly involves a country that's very close to me, Bangladesh. That's where I served as a Peace Corps volunteer. So it's a very low-lying and densely populated country without adequate infrastructure. It's estimated that a 1 meter rise in sea level could displace 40 million people there. So this is an issue of loss of life and irreparable damage.
Inequality is not just an economic issue. It's also about access to opportunity and the capacity to make choices. Take access to education, for example, and the asymmetry experienced by gender. According to UNESCO, an estimated 130 million girls between the ages of 6 to 17 are still denied the right to education. Discriminatory gender norms and harmful practices deny girls access to school and quality learning. Families and cultures might favor education for boys, and girls are often prevented from attending school, even if they're keen to do so. It's not just about access to education in schools, it's also about feeling safe in classrooms and feeling supported in the subjects and careers they want to pursue, including fields in which they're underrepresented. The climate crisis will make this worse and contributes to education disruption. The climate crisis is driving forced migrations, for one thing, also known as climate refugees, which contributes to war and violence. It also is creating frequent and intense drought and famine, which has ties to family roles and gender norms. Women and children, for example, are responsible for water collection in 71% of sub-Saharan households without drinking water. Furthermore, 25 million girls and women in lower income countries say they want but don't have the ability to choose whether and when to become pregnant, which will affect their ability to attain an education.
So race is another key piece to asymmetry in education, access, achievement, and experience. In the 1960s, researchers developed this term achievement gap while they were studying disparities in academic performance between groups of students, particularly around race. Shifting from a deficit model, research also started to focus on what's called opportunity gaps, really just to better reflect that the obstacles and conditions students encounter in their educational experiences are often tied to inequitable systems that don't nurture opportunities to succeed and thrive. Studies currently are also starting to look more at outcomes. Well, no, I think that they've been doing this for a long time, but just the way they're approaching is differently. Studies have been looking at like lower income students who are often people of color, non-native English speakers, students in rural communities, and affluent peers, but also more so on, let's say, implicit bias that educators are bringing to the classroom and how those biases actually impact student gaps and suspension rates. So it's not about just the individual, but their system and the people that are part of that. And if you consider the fact that climate change is really hitting Black, Brown, and Indigenous and low-income communities the most, they're suffering most immediately and most severely, typically. This additional burden of the climate impacts on education is just exacerbating already existing disparities that are connected to race and to income and can impact the ability to consistently gain access to education. So if you remove barriers to access and students with opportunity gaps are then able to actually apply themselves in different spaces, they're very capable of succeeding and finding significance and meaning from their participation in something, for example, like a K through 12 advanced placement or IB class, or in college, a global education experience. And in open doors, if you think about global experiences, there's been a lot of discussion about how race is reflected, how diversity is reflected is normally how it's discussed. So there is a lot of, there's improvement with diversity within US college students participating, but still very underrepresented if you compare the number of students in colleges and how many people are actually participating in global experiences. One thing that I think is really interesting, though, is when you look at the top 10 destination lists in Open Doors reports, and some regions of the world are just completely absent, such as Africa and the Middle East as examples. So while the Open Doors report shows these improvements in diversity by race, there's still a continued preference for study in certain geographic locations over others. And when I think back to this topic of colonization and also think about climate impacts, it's really impossible for me to look at top 10 lists the same anymore and not wonder, where are these preferences for destination or university partnerships stemming from, and how much are they connected to embedded attitudes and values assigned to countries or regions of the world through our language, through our politics, through our history, and through our education. Last year, there was an article called Educating International Students About Race. And Karen Fisher interviewed international students, international educators, and chief diversity officers. I really enjoyed this article because I found a lot of the content to be relevant across many areas of our sector, not just with the international student populations. I think we can learn from this regardless of the area. So one student that she spoke to was a graduate student from Ecuador. And I loved the quote that she had in here. The student said, I've come to think of learning about being anti-racist the same way I think about learning a language. I'm never going to be perfect at it. I'm going to continue to be corrected, and I'm going to keep trying. Man, I thought if we could all apply that to being better people. But the one thing about talking about race is you often need to create safe spaces to have those conversations. And it can't just be one space at one time from one source. It can be stressful, it can be embarrassing, it can be challenging, it can be emotional, it can be emboldening, it can be a really positive experience to talk about race. But you do often need to find safe space to talk about it. And the other thing I would say is, the concept of race is not always going to present itself the same in every location or situation or in every individual. And global status does not remove the potential for having racialized or discriminatory experiences, whether that is, for example, a US student of whatever background going to a new location and having experiences abroad, or whether that's a student coming to the United States and maybe for the first time feeling like they're part of a people of color category, for example. Yvonne Garcia is a Chief Diversity Officer, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer at the College of Worcester. And she was also featured in the article and recommended, in the case of international students, a good way to talk about race is to find common ground, drawing connections between the home countries and the US, talking, for example, about colorism, which exists just about everywhere, or other potential forms of bias in their native cultures. So essentially, the idea is you have to create some opportunities outside of just the international office. You have to consider it outside of the classroom. You have to consider the community, extend beyond the campus, engage, and find ways for the students to get involved in understanding the community and the population that's part of the surroundings of the campus. And consider also that this isn't something that you want to try to tackle alone. It's not necessarily a one-off thing you can check off on a list for orientation and say, yes, we talked about race. It's really going to have to be an ongoing effort in order to be impactful. So it does require it to be a partnership and also to drive a lot of campus culture to make these efforts move forward. And just finally, faculty and staff are a huge part of these efforts, and their voices can have a huge impact on students. So part of the process of getting these conversations out has to come from within the classroom, within the academics and the curriculum. But that also ties into things like hiring and recruitment practices and just a general campus culture of whether it's important for campuses to diversify their faculty and staff. So there's a lot to unravel in this topic. I've said a lot. I'm sure you can't absorb all of it at one sitting, but how do we better understand the intersections of human experiences, especially since these intersectionalities can make particular individuals, groups, communities, or nations more vulnerable to the impacts of the climate crisis and injustice.
Thanks, Ine. So as international educators, what we're doing is we're looking for connections across the intersections of climate change, racial and social injustice, and international education, so that we can apply climate action through an international education lens and from a justice-centered perspective. We understand that the impacts of climate change are not being felt equally and need to consider what that means within the context of our field. In order to do so, let's go back to the root of the word intersectionality. What is intersectionality? Intersectionality is a term coined by Kimberly Williams Crenshaw in 1989 to describe how race, class, gender, and other individual characteristics intersect with one another and overlap. Intersectionality describes the way people from different backgrounds encounter the world, especially across race and gender. Originally used in the context of the court system as a legal term, this has become an important term used to describe how injustices are compounded across a cross-section of intersectional identities. And despite the term's initial obscurity and use primarily in legal spaces, today this is a term used widely in a sense that has gone viral and is used around the world to address various human rights issues, and is something that can play an important purpose in our international education space. So taking a look at this next slide, the climate crisis is an intersectional issue. Climate change and racial justice are intimately linked crises at the heart of the climate change and environmental justice movement, hence the term climate justice. While this Venn diagram visually highlights these intersections as having an equal overlap, disproportionate impacts of climate change are felt most urgently by low-income, Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities. It's taken time for many of the large, historic, and well-funded nonprofits at the center of climate activism to shift from a climate-first mentality to embrace climate change efforts in a new way. Now, Organizations and individuals alike are beginning to address climate action and solutions in more just ways that center, include, and uplift historically marginalized people and communities. In international education, our efforts to engage in on-site global experiences do contribute to global warming and climate change through the burning of fossil fuels, the emission of greenhouse gases via our activities, industries, and travel. That being said, it also offers opportunities for transformational experiences. It brings together minds to create common solutions to global problems. It strengthens partnerships, it strengthens understanding, and creates empathy across borders and experiences. So how do we find a balance in understanding and addressing systemically embedded injustices at local and global levels? See how that's reflected in the disproportionate impacts of climate change, and take action to be part of the solution as international educators. What does that look like? Let's dive into that next. As we work to move forward to find climate solutions and take climate action, let's also consider our past, think about how we might contribute to barriers and challenges in the present, and connect the dots between climate justice and international education.
So now we're going to take a look at some of the existing issues that occur at the center of that Venn diagram. So the hard truth about student mobility is we still have problems with access. As much as we work to address these issues, international programs remain out of reach for many of our students. So just as we see on the national and global scales, those who contribute most are least affected, and those who contribute the least to the climate crisis are precisely those who are impacted first and worst. So as an example, if we look at US education abroad, though we're making progress, the most recent data from Open Doors still shows that nearly 70% of US students going abroad and earning credit are white, and nearly 70% identify as women. So just to be clear, this is not to say that white people and women or anybody should stop studying abroad or participating in international programs. This point is simply to emphasize that our field reflects a larger context in which we exist. For most of us, the demographics of students on our programs don't yet reflect our overall student populations on our campuses. And for many institutions, our student populations don't reflect our local communities. So work needs to be done in all areas across all industries, but international education is our area of impact. This is where we do the work to address these disparities. So Megan will go ahead and talk about program trends.
Thanks, Adrienne. So something to keep an eye on with regard to student education abroad programs are different trends that we want to keep an eye on. One of those trends is short-term programs. Open Doors data show a dramatic increase in short-term education abroad participation in recent years. Regardless of program duration, travel has been a required component of participation in these programs. So whether a student pursues an entire degree abroad or is just abroad for 2 weeks, theoretically, they could do so with only one round-trip ticket. So how does the rise in short-term programming affect sustainability in your program or portfolio? Something else to keep an eye on is something that we talk about as greenwashing. So greenwashing is the process of conveying a false impression or providing misleading information about how a company's products are more environmentally sound. Greenwashing is considered an unsubstantiated claim to deceive consumers into believing a company's products are environmentally friendly. It's a marketing ploy some businesses enact to attract consumers that want to be environmentally responsible without having to go through the process of actually being environmentally responsible. In recent years, we've seen a lot of exciting progress in the international education community pertaining to sustainability. It's, of course, incredibly positive to see conferences and communities like the Forum centering this in conversations, launching community guidelines, integrating the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. But as we see more and more organizations, programs, and offices seek more sustainable practices, it's vitally important for us as responsible educators to ensure we are on the lookout for any greenwashing in our field, vetting systems behind slogans, asking tough questions, understanding the myriad practices and challenges that go along with working toward genuine sustainability. Understanding it takes more than just offsetting flights to be a sustainable traveler. And thinking about the carbon handprint, the positive environmental impact, as opposed to just the carbon footprint, which is the negative carbon impact, are just some of the ways that we can approach this. And I'll hand it over to Ine for risk management.
Thank you. Had a little trouble with my mute button, but I'm back. Okay, so risk management is something that I maybe got a little bit too involved in at some point, considering my job description. But I will say this, the IPCC report says that even as we work to mitigate the climate crisis, we're going to still have to expect at least another 30 years of extreme climate patterns, like the fires and floods and drought and storms that we've all been seeing and hearing about and experiencing. And that's going to impact choices and decisions that we make in international education around risk management. If you just start by considering some basics like health insurance, the requirements and the plans that we use. I know it's different in every country. I know some countries have a more government-based plan, and some you can choose, and some they're driven by policies of the campus. But I have noticed, during this pandemic, there's been a lot of unequal access and unequal treatment of people. So I kept thinking about how is that impacting visiting international students, or how are people being treated when they're abroad if they're dealing with this abroad? It just kept running through my mind. So when you think about the climate crisis and how much it impacts global health, we have to also think about how are students and staff and faculty potentially disproportionately impacted, treated, or supported during a worldwide pandemic, for example, or in relation to health matters stemming from environmental exposure, or in relation to their identities. Health impacts are also closely related to relocation, and just as much as they are to climate impacts. Temporary housing assignments or relocation may be needed at home or during an on-site global experience. And to kind of share a couple of examples of this, Adrienne has cited a few times to us in stories about her experience as working within faculty-led challenge of navigating a remote search for housing solutions for a group of students who were in the middle of their program and the road was closed due to a mudslide, heavy downpour, and you just had to figure out a different option because there was no way through. I myself had an experience during the large earthquakes in Mexico when we had the entire campus infrastructure shut down. It was no longer safe to go to class. The students were either living on campus or off campus, but all the housing was no longer viable. And so we found ourselves in a situation where we had to kind of figure out a different way to support relocation to a new study site, but also organize housing assignments and new campus assignments to avoid disruption of their studies. And if I think back to my own graduate studies, I actually lived with a group of international students for one part of my studies. And all of them were there for their full degree. And our apartment had a roof leak after this really severe storm that wasn't immediately fixed. So the conditions, if you can imagine, over a little bit of time became very unhealthy for us. But my roommates were scared to challenge the situation. And I remember talking to them about us having rights. We have rights. And that we needed to stay united in our effort to get fair treatment. It worked out for us, but it was very stressful in needing to navigate the local laws, the health support, the finances, and it was all in the middle of our graduate studies in a city that wasn't home for any of us. So essentially what I'm saying is, there's going to be a need to adapt to both the expected and the unexpected changes and situations. The climate crisis is shifting, and we're seeing higher frequencies of emergency climate disaster. Obviously we have some work to do to get that going in a different direction. But one thing I know is that transportation is always going to be a big part of risk management as well. And the conversations that we have around that have to consider how climate impacts just the ability to go somewhere, to leave. It can restrict or reduce access. It can impact mobility in general. It can lead to last minute changes in mobilization actions and efforts during emergencies. So there's a lot to think about. This is a lot to share with y'all. But I hope this starts to get you thinking about how these things are connected.
So now that we've spent some time exploring some of the existing issues at the intersection of climate justice and international education, let's talk about some of the positive actions that we can take moving forward. As Pitulia mentioned in the welcome video and Megan mentioned in the last slide, in addition to the concept of the carbon footprint, there's an emerging concept of the carbon or ecological handprint. And I'd like to talk about that a little more, but a couple points about the footprint first. So a carbon footprint is a measure of the impact your activities have on the amount of greenhouse gas produced through the burning of fossil fuels and is expressed as a weight of CO2 emissions in tons. So we're going to share an article in the chat. And so this article, as well as others, have linked the popularization of the term carbon footprint to British Petroleum in a marketing effort to shift blame from the fossil fuel industry onto the individual consumer. So the fact that this term has become commonly used just shows the wide-reaching influence of the fossil fuel industry. I mean, they're in our heads, we're trying to work against them and we're using their terms. Of course, our individual behaviors and spending habits do add up, and collectively we can drive change, positive and negative. So where the footprint is a measure of negative impact, the handprint is a measure of positive impact. So this idea is really to shift focus from the doom and gloom into action and positive change. Rather than terrifying people about their individual or collective carbon footprint, the handprint concept encourages action toward positive environmental impact. So the goal really is to have a larger handprint than a footprint. I'll go ahead and turn it over to Megan to talk about regenerative programs.
Thanks, Adrienne. So on the note of a handprint mentality to assessing and addressing the climate crisis, there's things we can implement into global education programming that allows practitioners and participants to better understand and enact this. So one of the difference between sustainability and regenerativity is that while sustainability means withdrawing or lessening the impact or the negative or contributing to a more positive impact, regeneration refers to creating the conditions for life to continuously renew itself, transcend into new forms, and flourish amid ever-changing life conditions. So the concept of regenerativity is something that you can build into your international education program directly. This is done through the concept of regenerative programs, which incorporates active regenerative measures as part of the programming. Another thing that you can build into programming is educating not just for climate change or educating students about the climate crisis, but educating for climate justice with a specific intention of creating climate activists. Another way to leave a positive carbon handprint is through programming, which is central to the Green program where I work, which is designing the programs that students don't just understand the predicament that we find ourselves in, but are equipped with inspiration and tools and resources and connections that allow them to stay connected with these concepts long term, give them the resources to engage when they return to their campuses, and bring these activities into their future careers and personal lives. And I'll hand it over to Ine to talk about program location.
Thanks. As we look to create activists, as Megan mentioned, it's important to help students access diverse perspectives from their education and experiences. What are the voices that students are learning to admire? Who are they seeing as the experts in addressing the issues that they care about? What level of respect is given to local communities? And where are students going to further expand their educational knowledge and experiences? Well, in Open Doors, they summarized that over 55% of US college students choose to study abroad in Europe. And NAFSA reviewed their 2018-2019 data, Open Doors data to highlight that around 40% of US students study in just 5 countries: the United Kingdom, Italy, Spain, France, and Germany. And I bet you, if you work in education abroad, you could have guessed that. Their report is essentially highlighting efforts to support policies and support diversity and participation by underrepresented student groups and by location, citing global experiences as a way to prepare for career success and to collectively strengthen our economy and diplomacy and national security. But it's also to strengthen abilities to work with other countries. We also need to consider, though, how diversity can shift values and beliefs. One thing I think about often when people talk about, strengthening abilities to work with other countries is how little we do to really strengthen people's ability to work with one another at home. Being global does not necessarily translate to being anti-racist, for example. So what can we do to kind of bring those things together? Regardless of the final destination, though, regardless of where someone's going or what experience they're having, the greenhouse gas emissions that they have from their travel are going to continue to carry that unequal global burden for less wealthy nations, especially in the local and rural populations. And as we know, in the field of international education, we depend on travel for our students in particular, mostly by air. Not only do our students try to fly to their host destinations, but international education professionals and faculty travel for many different reasons, including program development, visiting partners, recruiting students, attending conferences, and so much more. So if we can maybe start by looking at where we can maybe cut back, that'd be a good start so that if we do have to have travel happen by air, that we are leaving that for a student to have that experience to get somewhere. Air travel essentially is accounting for about 2.5% of global carbon dioxide emissions, which maybe doesn't seem like a lot at the moment, but emissions are growing rapidly with the expansion of low-cost airlines, for example, and the booming tourism industry. And even if the aviation industry meets all of its emissions targets, it's going to have consumed 12% of the global carbon budget for the 1.5 degrees Celsius by 2050. So if it fails to reach its targets, aviation's share of the budget could rise to as much as 27%. And in our field, the trend has been moving towards short-term programs. So the challenge is that short-term programs, which equals more flights, also are seen as improving accessibility to transformative international experiences. So we need to get creative to find ways to continue to improve access while reducing our negative impact. And I would say also just this note that our advising and our language can also influence students' decisions to pursue a particular program type or destination. And I have endless stories of students having shared comments from friends, family, faculty, staff that drive their decisions to pursue a particular experience before they even know what opportunities exist. It's important that students understand what's at their table and how to access and understand their available options to make informed decisions for themselves.
Thanks. So since the beginning of the pandemic, we've seen a boom in virtual education programs, virtual global education. And I'm among those who champion COIL at my institution because I fully believe that these and other virtual programs can be incredibly valuable learning experiences. They can be a wonderful way to improve access to global learning for those who are unable to travel. However, virtual programming should be a part of a diverse portfolio of programs and should not be viewed as a substitute for immersive international experiences. So we invited Andrew Gordon of Diversity Abroad to our CANI Live two-part series on climate justice and international education back in February. In it, he said something that really stuck with me. He brought up a word of caution about using virtual programming to expand access to underserved students. So we really need to be cognizant to avoid creating two separate streams of global education opportunities. So they would be one for students who have resources to travel abroad, and the other stream would be for those who don't have those resources to go abroad. So as we move forward with incorporating global learning into curricula by virtually connecting students around the globe, this is a reminder to continue working to increase access to all global learning opportunities.
Great. So whether this is something that you're already working hard on at your organization or your institution, or if this is entirely new to you and new to your role, let's talk about finding a starting point or potentially finding a new starting point moving forward from today. On this next slide, I want to take a look at just a small snapshot of things that we're aware of that are happening in the field. Ine, Adrian, and myself have been operating with CANI from the US for the past year and a half. And these are some of the things that we've been more involved in, but we're eager to hear about what's happening in other regions. The field of international education has started to bring conversations around climate change and sustainability into the fold, amplifying these topics and addressing industry standards, best practices, partnerships, portfolios, and more. So again, on this slide, you can see highlighted some of the actions taking place now with some key organizations amongst international educators. And I'd like to talk a little bit about now and shortly in our networking session, which we hope you stick around for, how we can push these conversations forward. To note, again, this slide provides just a small sample of what is being done and is limited to a few key regions. As we move into that discussion and networking, please do drop into the chat or let us know when we break out anything that you're aware of that's happening in these regions or beyond these regions at your institution or at your organization to bring these conversations to the forefront of our field. So that being said, NAFSA, which we're all likely aware of, the largest nonprofit association dedicated to international education and exchange. It serves international educators in their institution and organizations by setting standards of good practice, providing training, professional development opportunities, and lots more. It's been exciting to see them launch a sustainability special interest group, which is dedicated to helping colleagues connect, discuss, and act to create more sustainable practices. It's invited CANI board members to be part of assessing where we are at as a field in terms of sustainability. It's brought sustainability topics to their conferences as the headline topic of the overall conference, as well as bringing it into more active streams of different topics within that conference. And it's also highlighted justice in particular, as well as sustainability topics more broadly through workshops and events that they host throughout the year. Similarly, the Forum on Education Abroad, as the standards development organization for the field, has done something similar. They recently created a guide to advancing the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals through education abroad. And Adrienne, my co-presenter here today, played a pivotal role in developing and launching those guidelines. So I'm sure she'd be happy to talk about that with anyone interested to learn more about that process and what that entails in more depth. They've also integrated sustainability into their events, their conferences, and their workshops, including making it the core topic of their last annual conference and continuing that in future conferences. Other organizations that might be on your radar, they're doing a lot in this space, include ASHE, which is a US-based organization with a global reach, who has a really exciting annual global conference. It's not limited to international education. ASHE is a network of sustainability professionals throughout the higher education space. Often they are faculty or they are staff members within the sustainability offices at campuses across the world who are solely dedicated to addressing the climate crisis in higher education. More and more, we're seeing international educators be present in those conversations at their events in their global conference. And similarly, we're seeing more ASHE professionals, staff, and faculty reaching out to international educators to bring people in our space into their conversations and trying to create more partnership across what can often be different silos across our campuses. In other regions, AIEC, the Australian International Education Conference, has a lot of featured topics about this. Times Higher Education Impact Rankings, I believe when you look at the top 10 universities who are placing highest on attaining sustainable development, addressing the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, I think the overwhelming majority of them are in Australia and New Zealand. So the region in particular is obviously doing a lot to educate for sustainable development, and that's reflected in the events and in the conferences that are hosted in that region. Similarly, in EAIE, the European Association for International Educators, you see the topics related to climate justice and sustainability cropping up more and more in their conferences and in the events that they host. And again, we're going to be getting to a networking session shortly. There's so much I'm sure that we are leaving out here, and I'd be really excited to hear from anyone attending what else is happening and what more we can do in these spaces.
So if you are itching to do something more as you move through CANI's COP26 Climate Action Week, we encourage you to keep, number one, climate justice anchored in your thoughts and plans. And we want to remind you that there's already many, many ways to get involved, such as the different organizations that Megan just outlined, but also directly with CANI. And I want you to consider What are you going to be part of? What will you be part of? And in CANI, there's actually 3 chapters currently that are going to actually be hosting regional meetings this week. So we hope that we'll see you there. One of the newest chapters is the Americas chapter, and they're going to also be hosting a information session on Wednesday, November 10th at 12 noon. So that'll be a great place to learn more about that newest chapter. There's also going to be a global regional meeting as part of the regions, because we know that we don't represent all voices or all perspectives or all information, and we need to get to that point. But until we do, we have a space so that people that don't have a home in a specific regional chapter can still come and make their voices heard and meet with people. And then CANI has a lot of different ways to connect, starting with our website, where you can go to join and sign up to get a newsletter sent out to you with updates on a regular basis, but also social media, which is in everybody's sphere nowadays, even if you're not on there all the time. So you can connect on the spaces like LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, even Facebook still. But also, if you have skills, if you are super passionate about social media, that's a way that you can help organizations like CANI, these grassroots organizations, bring those to the plate. And then I love the CANI Climate Dialogues podcast. And we actually have with us this evening, CJ Tremblay, who's the wonderful host of that podcast. It's a great way to invite different voices from the field to conversations on climate action. And I love that we can see it on video or we can hear it on a podcast and wherever we listen. And finally, climate justice is what connected Adrienne, Megan, and I in CANI. And we've been talking about this for quite a long time now. But if you're feeling inspired by this topic yourself and you want to get involved, we can invite you to join us on Slack. We have a working group that's focused on climate justice, and we would love to have you be a part of it. So please let us know.
Okay, so now that you have seen some of the ways you can get involved in this movement, we encourage you to take these simple steps. So these simple actions. So first, this is easier said than done, but think differently. Please fight the desire to return to what we knew as normal before the pandemic. So trust us, we know that flying around the globe might be part of your identity as an international educator, but this moment demands a culture shift. So to Ine's earlier point, rethink if travel is absolutely necessary for meeting colleagues, attending conferences, and doing the work of international education. And when you do fly, really make it worth it. So among my hopes and dreams is clean jet fuel, but until that day comes, please save the flights for students and make sure that their experiences really help them improve our collective situation. Amplify this message across your networks. Talk about climate justice. Use your influence to inspire others to want to do more and to take action. So we have a challenge for you, should you choose to accept it. So next week is International Education Week, and there will be lots of programming around the benefits of international education. So our challenge to you is to think about climate justice during these events that you may attend, and make a comment or ask a question about the climate and social justice impacts of the topic. And then let us know how it goes. We encourage you to start these conversations, even if you might not feel prepared to do so. And that really brings me to the next point. So we hear a lot from people in international ed who feel like they're not knowledgeable enough to move forward with climate justice, or maybe they feel that they don't have the right background or have the right lived experience to speak intelligently about climate justice. So these resources here really can kind of help folks build that confidence to start having these conversations. We don't want anybody to wait to kind of move this forward and create that buzz. We're dropping a couple links in the chat for training opportunities for you. The first one, the Climate Reality Project, is Al Gore's organization that trains climate reality leaders to speak about the climate crisis. Both CANI's co-founders, Elsa Lamont and Pitulia Nicola, and all 3 of the presenters today are trained climate reality leaders. Project Drawdown is another really great one, and Ina used one of their images earlier in the presentation. It's an online training program focused on solutions. And so again, being positive, thinking about forward action in those solutions. You can do the training yourself, or you could use it in the classroom with your students. So please check both of those out. So climate justice work will look different all around the world. So this session obviously reflects the speakers' perspectives as US American women, and we like to incorporate other perspectives. As a global organization, CANI is in a unique position to speak to this issue on a global level and from a variety of perspectives and experiences. So we have the ability to create spaces for voices that are currently and historically marginalized. So our industry is really poised to combine our efforts to address integrated solutions. We may not have all of the solutions right now, but we hope that this session has sparked a fire and a call to action for you. As Naomi Klein said in her book, On Fire, the Case for the Green New Deal, we face so many overlapping and intersecting crises that we cannot afford to fix them one at a time. We need integrated solutions, solutions that radically bring down emissions while creating huge numbers of good unionized jobs and delivering meaningful justice to those who have been most abused and excluded under the current extractive economy. So reflecting on these topics, finding allies and opening dialogue are just some of the first steps. And while we may not always feel that we have the knowledge or skill set to address these complex issues on our own, please know that you can be part of the CANI network. We're here to support you, and united we can make a difference. So with that, we want to thank you so much for joining this session. If you'd like to follow up with us in regard to anything we discussed today or connect in relation to our organizations, we invite you to take note of our contact details here. You can find us on LinkedIn. We encourage you to be in touch with us and join the international education community's effort to advance climate justice. We'll also be dropping a link to the session evaluation in the chat. We pay really close attention to your feedback, so please take a moment to give us your thoughts there. So now we're going to go ahead and move into the Q&A and networking session.
And I've been keeping an eye on the chat to see if there were a slew of questions, and you all were making some great comments and we were sharing lots of links in there, but no big driving questions right now. So I thought the best thing for us to do is just to go straight into these small group spaces and have a chance for you to talk about this topic with everyone. Let me leave you with one thing to consider as we break out into these smaller groups. What is one action, just one action you can take to advance climate justice in your work? Think about that. And then we'll go ahead and jump into these groups for maybe around 15 or 20 minutes or as long as you can stay. And we'll, the folks here that have been, Megan, Adrienne, and I, we're gonna go bounce around and kind of check in with y'all. All right, so give me 1 second. I'll put you in those rooms. Okay.
So we want to invite you now to go ahead and turn on your video because we're going to be in these smaller, more intimate groups now. Hello.
Hello. Hello. How is everyone?
Good. Excited to be here.
Awesome. Hi. Oh, you have to like wave in front of your person in a virtual background. Yeah. Great. So, in terms of like facilitation, I'm just like joining this session because I think Adrienne and Ine and Megan are awesome. So I'm going to sort of, I'd love to hear a little bit more from you, but again, like I'm CJ, I am on the CANI board, and I'm super excited to sort of hand it over to you guys and hear what you thought about the session, what your key takeaways are, and then like that one action. Just talk. Was this like all familiar to people, or was this like totally bit of a new concept?
If I talk about myself, I'm kind of new to this thing, and yeah, I'm into education management sector based in Canada, but I was a student of science, and I have read about climate change once upon a time. So I'm fascinated towards knowing more about it. So I thought it's a good opportunity to join this platform to know about it. So that's why I'm into this meeting. what I think is one action which we can take is to educate international students about it, because they are the new ones. They are young blood. They can understand about the changes which are happening in the environment, and they can take actions, positive actions towards sustaining the environment.
Well, welcome. We're glad you're on the journey now. There's no going back.
Thank you.
Amy, sorry, I think I cut you off earlier.
Yeah, I was going to say I'd love to hear where everyone's tuning in from and what you all do at your various organizations. And since I'm volunteering it, I can start. So my name is Amy Marcus, and I'm a senior program manager for credentials at HubSpot, which is, I just started a month ago. It is very not international education related or climate action related, but that's really been one of my interests and passions for a long time. My background's in international education, and I focused a lot on gender and climate change at my time in grad school. So now that I've finally kind of landed in a stable job that has some work-life balance, I'm finding the energy again to reconnect to this work, and I'm excited to look for ways to get involved. So I'm really stoked for this week. Oh, and I'm sorry, I'm in California.
My name's Hannah Bradshaw. I am in Sydney, Australia right now. University of Sydney is my background, so I am an exchange advisor for outbound exchange at the University of Sydney. I specifically manage USA, students going to the USA, Canada, and the Netherlands. And yeah, I'm pretty new, so I've only been in this position for about a month. But I've been with the Sydney Global Mobility team for 3 years as a casual peer advisor, and I did my own exchange 3 years ago. So yeah, still very much in that area of international education. But it is definitely something that we've been thinking about more in our team, about now that the borders are opening in Australia and that exchange is looking more likely to recommence next year, yay. How can we incorporate more sustainable options and kind of educate our students better on incorporating that into their mobility experiences? So it's been really interesting starting to kind of get our heads around these ideas and these issues.
Good evening, or good morning. My name is Luisa Eriksson. I'm from Argentina, and I'm calling. We're in the middle of the evening here, so that's why I said good evening. I work at Argentine public university called Universidad Nacional de San Martín, UNSAM, at the international office. And so I work basically with internationalization of research, but in the office, of course, we deal with international mobility in general. And I've been following a little bit on your webpage, your activities, and I hadn't been able to connect until now. But I think this is a very urgent matter. And as we are discussing now, going back to mobilities again, not only virtual mobilities, but, physical mobilities. And I think it's a real challenge to talk about this elephant in the room, right? Or what, I don't know if you call it a white elephant in the room, right? Or like the issue that we don't talk about, that
the elephant in the room.
Yeah, exactly. So it's like it's really and it's so difficult because we, as I guess also for you in Australia, and we're so far away. So it's unless we talk about mobilities from our neighboring countries, it's really, we're so far away in terms of traveling. And so it's a real issue, like a moral issue to discuss.
Yeah, definitely. And,
so I'm interested in having more tools to that. That's my because we try to find so many ways to look for funding and financing of mobilities, and and we also know that there are limits, of course, with the virtual mobilities. Because also in some countries have not that same access to technology, and there is a huge resistance actually to hybrid learning. So we talk about either virtual learning or present, like in class. So this concept of hybrid learning is very difficult for middle income countries, I think. And so, yeah, these are some of the.
There's a lot. There's a lot, and it's so great that you're able to sort of to join. I mean, Amy and I mean Hannah. I don't know if you're involved in the Oceania chapter, but Luisa and Amy, there's an Americas chapter that is starting for the first time, which is super exciting. And it sounds like, Luisa, I love your passion where you're like, there's a problem and we need to address it as a sector. And what this specific session I thought was so interesting is like the just or unjust distribution of harm, right? Most people who are harmed by the emissions caused by international education do not even have the opportunity to engage in international education. They tend to be sort of just sort of Black and Indigenous and people of color in those communities and countries that, you know, sub-Saharan Africa, there's not a lot of students doing mobility in sub-Saharan Africa, and that's who's expecting to bear most of the harm. So in terms of like actions within the sector that you, I mean, Hannah and Luisa, you both talk about mobility is coming back, and what does that mean from a justice standpoint?
It's really hard in Australia because we are far away. We've got New Zealand next to us. It's about a 3-hour flight. It's even 6 hours from one end of the country to the other, different time zones. So it's a huge country, and we have a huge culture in Australia of travel, particularly to Europe and America, places like that. And people do big gap year trips, and particularly with students, travel is really a big part of that. And, you know, the University of Sydney has the biggest mobility program in the country. So it's difficult balancing that desire for Australians to travel and our huge program with our hundreds of partner universities worldwide, and then mitigating that with the kind of, obviously, these issues of climate, you know, flights. We can't really, unlike in Europe, get a train to the next city. Right. Our flights are minimum 24 hours to long plane trips. So the huge amounts of fossil fuels being used there just to get us to Europe or the US. So that is definitely a big question, a big thing that we're thinking about, just because of the isolation of us in this part of the world. Even getting to Asia, can take about 12, 13 hours. So, you know, that's a really obvious thing, but then there are obviously other things that students can be more aware of when they're overseas, kind of reducing waste and things like that. But the biggest thing is definitely, as Luisa mentioned, just the location and having to travel by plane. It's a real issue.
Mm-hmm. May I ask a question? So I have worked as a service provider in the sector for 10 years. Like I work in language testing and student recruitment. So I've not been in an institution. I have been on the conference circuit and going to conferences and stuff. And what I don't have full visibility on in my experience, and Luisa, like I'd be super keen to hear from you as well, like how much of, you know, things are coming back and international education is coming back, how much of that is like culturally within your institutions, people who are staff and who are workers at the institution, like are just, and not the students, because I don't believe that that's a just request, is to like stop all student travel. That's not at all like the solution. But in terms of the staff, like what's the culture like in terms of how much of it is being driven, like how much travel happens at the staff level, and how much of it is like, you know, when Adrian asks the question, like, is it really necessary? Like, have we not all demonstrated that we can do our work differently now? So I'd love to hear from you too at institutions, just because I don't have that perspective.
From my perspective, I cannot speak on behalf of the institution, of course, but what I see and is that there's also an absence of data, you know. So normally we have very good data on student mobility, but we also have like a lack of data in terms of staff mobility, because some staff inform about their mobility and others don't. So there's not like an obligation for them to inform when they go abroad. Either if they go to like a short for 1 week or a conference or something, or they tend to inform when it's linked to a financing through the institution. So that's like the first point. And in general terms, we have been carrying out surveys within the institution and also other universities in Argentina and in some other South American countries, Brazil, Chile. And what we found was that in general terms, internationalization is oftentimes prioritized by staff, or internationalization is prioritized in postgraduate training. So there's no like everyone agrees on that. It's good to do mobilization when you're staff or senior staff or your PhD. So that's, yeah.
So from a justice standpoint, these are the questions that I'm so curious about, and I'd love to hear, because do people who are in very senior positions, should they be traveling? Because most of it, the professional travel from a justice standpoint is younger professionals networking, and those in-person experiences can help develop your career, whereas more senior staff tend to be more established and maybe don't need to benefit from that as much. But there's certainly a sense of well, I'm very senior and I should travel.
Yeah, CJ, I saw that a lot in my last position. So I was at UC Berkeley Extension, and essentially, the folks who worked with international students, the folks who were higher up, were typically able to do these really big international recruitment trips to East Asia, to Europe. While I remember I had to really fight to get permission to attend the Northern California District Conference that I was involved in running, that I was actually helping put it on. And it would have been an hour drive for me one night in a hotel. And I remember just being this seems strange. And I'm helping put on an event. And so in a sense, my presence is a little more necessary than you just going on these international trips to talk to partners. Anyway, I saw that a lot with certain individuals being able to travel more than others, and it was definitely inequitable in a number of ways. Yeah.
And Abhinav, I'd be curious, because you mentioned you work with student recruitment in Canada. So you're based in Canada?
Yeah, in Vancouver, yeah.
And same.
I see.
So that's awesome. And is that in an agent, sort of education agent supporting role, or
sorry, I forgot to introduce myself before. So just a brief introduction. I work as admissions officer in Canada College, Vancouver. Yeah,
okay,
so
cool.
it's a private college located in downtown Vancouver, and I always think about it because a lot of international students come to Canada. Around 60% from India. So I'm from India. So yeah, a lot of travel happens. And when you were talking about international travel, I was wondering why we are not talking about the domestic travel as well. Domestic means local travel. When I come to my college every day, I drive around 40 kilometers one side. So the work which I do here can be done from home as well. So in the last 1 year, more than 1 year during pandemic, we have seen that people have worked from home, and that had worked very well. Most of the organizations, they saved in terms of resources, of monetary terms, they have gained a lot by people working from home. So I guess, yeah, there are things which we can think about, and working from home can be one permanent option for at least some part of the people in one organization. Yeah, this is what I feel. So, and when it comes to the international students, that is inevitable because they are coming here for studies and then for settle down permanent basis. So yeah, a lot of international travel happens when employees also go. I have been in Canada for now more than 2 years, but I have never been back to India. So yeah, I guess there could be some things which we can discuss on this platform to find out solutions for finding out like how we can not stop, but how we can limit the international as well as domestic travel to save on and save the climate. But then there are other issues which we can discuss on. For example, students, basically, I have seen students, they sometimes, this is my personal observation. I mean, I've seen students wasting resources sometimes. So like they are driving cars, they are buying and driving cars when they don't need that. They can use public transport, but then they still use that. So yeah, including me, I also, most of the time I drive. So I mean, yes, this is a very new platform for me, and I'm just want to learn more and more about it, and yeah, then maybe able to contribute.
You're asking all the right questions though. Like you're asked, that's the right thing, right? It's like, well, what are individuals doing? What are students doing? What is my international department doing? I don't know about you guys, but like at every specific institutions, but in Canada, international departments at public institutions have a tremendous amount of power, right? Because they bring in so much revenue, which subsidizes the education of domestic students. And so if you have an international office, like advocating for those policy changes that you're talking about, like we're letting people work from home, that can move the dial, but it's leveraging the power of an international office.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah.
I think also in terms of, I can't think of the word, sorry. My brain still hasn't woken up yet. But we've recently, obviously with the pandemic, we've been forced to not travel. And so we've had to adapt quickly to this new situation. And obviously the vaccine was made so amazingly quickly with everyone pulling together their resources. And I just think that kind of shows us that we can do something about climate change, and we're just not really wanting to. I mean, not individually, kind of these big corporations and governments worldwide. It hasn't been seen to be such an urgent issue as a global virus, but it is actually more serious. And so I think hopefully through the COVID pandemic, it'll be clearer to people in power and to organizations that things can be done quickly and we can adapt to these new ways of living. You know, in the global mobility sector at UCID, we've had virtual fairs where partners have presented on Zoom and they've worked really well. And so that might mitigate the need for travel regularly between partner universities, having these kind of mixed online and in-person fairs where information is shared. It's easily done virtually. So hopefully through COVID and having to adapt to be more virtual by distancing from each other, we can use those skills moving forward, thinking about climate change as our kind of next priority now. Yeah, so hopefully positive things will come out of these past 2 years.
So we're probably going to get kicked out of our networking room soon. But I kind of just wanted to close the loop almost, other than like, please join the regional meetings because you are all very I love the passion and energy. So please join your regional meeting and register for it. But like from a justice standpoint, like what are you thinking about maybe going back and thinking about, right? Not action can sometimes be hard at a big scale, but what might you sort of take away, like your one takeaway from today from a climate justice standpoint?
I am thinking about reducing the waste I and my family do on daily basis, I would say, in terms of, well, my wife and I are very cautious about wasting things, but still we can do more about it at home because everything you waste is because then they have to build it again. They have to manufacture it again. They have to produce it again. So it's all wastage of natural resources. So I'll try more and more think about it and control how to limit the wastage at home.
Awesome. If nothing else, I hope that we will see you at, if not your next step, I hope we'll see you at one of the regional meetings where, you know, understanding the system in which you're working, it's not just about individual action, right? We're like, how do we do this on like a systemic scale in the future? And so without sacrificing, you know, the justice element, without making too much focus on the problem at hand where we're gonna have inequities in the solution. So I hope we're all set then to see you soon.
Thank you very much. Very interesting.
Hosting.
Thank you.
Thank
It was
you.
nice to meet everybody.
Yeah, I feel like I got really lucky in our group. This is great.
Sorry for joining in late, by the way, guys. I was in a smaller group with just myself and somebody else, and they left, so I was thrown in here just to say
Awesome. No, that's great. I'm actually going to have to head out because we have another candy meeting very shortly. So I will, but it was a pleasure to see you. And I hope to see you at the regional meetings. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Bye. Bye, everyone.
Bye.